I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 158. And this week it is Terri's turn to be in the hot seat. What have you got for us today, Terri?
Well, Daisy, I have an episode from one of my favorites of Being Well with Rick and Forrest Hansen. Some may be familiar with them from other episodes I've done, but Rick Hansen is a very well-known psychologist who has written many books and does many talks. And his son, Forrest, is not a psychologist, but very interested in the field and just human nature. So they have lots of great discussions. So this episode is 260, How to Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Self-Doubt, Confidence, and Authenticity.
Could do with all of that.
Yeah, really. We mentioned this not too long ago in an episode. And so when I saw this one pop up, I thought, oh, that would be a good one to do. And I remember some people in the community where I work, in the TFM community, mentioned the imposter syndrome as being something for them as well. So I thought, oh, great, this will be a fun topic to do. So lots of people obviously already know what imposter syndrome is, and I'll go into a little more detail about it. But one of the things that they started off with that I thought was kind of interesting is Rick Hansen, as a psychologist, said that one of his concerns when we come up with concepts like this is what he would call syndrome creep, where we use the word syndrome or complex and we're kind of pathologizing or acting as if there are diagnostic criteria for things. We're kind of medicalizing it, I think was the word he used. So if you think about like the Cinderella complex or the Peter Pan syndrome, that these are not diagnosable things in actuality. But Forrest kind of jumped in. He said, yeah, but they're also very important because they help us to relate to people and to help capture people's experience. And he used the example of people being on the spectrum being such a commonly used phrase now. And when Forrest was kind of refuting it, he said, yeah, but the important thing about that is if someone does not meet the actual diagnostic criteria, they may really still be having the experience. And so sometimes overusing even these terms does help us to kind of include people and help people to feel understood.
Yeah, and more importantly, I guess, potentially offer some tips, advice, solutions for making them feel better, not to, necessarily, quote unquote, cure them. But yeah, if something sounds, oh yeah, that sounds like me, and maybe that might help how I'm feeling.
That's right. When I was a psychologist, I really disliked diagnosing people, but it did help to have at least a common frame to understand. When it's depression, often these things help.
Yeah.
When it's anxiety, often these things help, even though it wasn't pathologizing. So Forrest shared some interesting information that he found out about imposter syndrome, in that this phrase really first came into common use when more women were entering the workforce that had been previously dominated by men. So in essence, they tended to feel like imposters. They were always seeing, being compared and evaluating whether they would measure up. And then the two of them went into an interesting conversation about this, is that when you talk about a complex or syndrome like this, it really tends to indicate that the issue lies within the individual. And instead, it's really more of the environmental and social milieu in which this is occurring. So in essence, the self-doubt or comparing that the women felt in this situation really is amplified when the critical eye of whether you are measuring up is coming from others. So you can, again, imagine in that time and still to this day, others are comparing. Does she measure up? Does she actually meet the criteria, or was she given this job as a woman? Those kinds of things. So this is where that term of imposter syndrome really became common.
That's really interesting to hear of the history of the term.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that's where it originated.
And so really that comparison is really the underlying piece to most of imposter syndrome. And we'll talk more about that. So the imposter syndrome really is a description of normal experiences that people have of doubting their experience despite evidence that they are actually competent. So oftentimes when you hear people describe feeling like an imposter, from the outside, you can see that they're fully competent or capable in that area or qualified, but it's different than what their internalized experience of it is. Rick Hansen then talked back to psychological terms and Erickson's model of development, and he talked about the trust and shame dichotomy, and that really imposter syndrome is fear of exposure or being found out, or fear that I won't belong and I will be ousted. This reminded me of a time when you and I talked about an episode from Brene Brown's book about belonging and how important that is. So as we discussed in that episode, Daisy, that threat of not belonging is really fundamental to a lot of behavior, because not belonging could be very costly, not only emotionally, but physically and survival wise. So the imposter syndrome, that fear of not belonging, being seen as an outsider, being seen as incompetent or incapable, is really something that can feel quite threatening. So what many of us do when we're experiencing this is we try to accomplish more. We think that if I just do more, be more, learn more, become more expert, then I won't be compared negatively. I won't be seen as an imposter. The problem with this is that if you pass the test, let's say you feel a moment of relief after you realize no one thought you didn't know what you were talking about, or no one outed you as making this up or whatever, you feel a moment of relief. But then oftentimes that's when the justification in our mind begins. We start telling ourselves things like, well, you just got lucky. You've basically received the stay of execution. No one noticed this time, but next time it's going to happen. And so it pushes us for this constant need to improve, be better, be more. And I think, despite all of my notes, just talking from my head as I mentioned that, I think that's what really underlies this for most of us, is that it's really about an underlying sense of not being worthy. It's not about what degree do we have, or what training do we have, or what skills do I have. But if I don't feel worthy generally, this is just one way that will manifest in these particular areas. They talked about this idea of the difference between being successful versus feeling successful, or being worthy versus feeling worthy. And I thought this was really significant, because I know when I most have the imposter syndrome piece happening for me, it doesn't matter that I'm getting accolades or that I'm getting proof that I'm doing fine or a good job. I don't feel that. And therefore I have this constant pressure that I put on myself. It's not coming from external. And then he talked about, again, other areas of our lives, not just work. And it made me think about romantic relationships. And I think some of my insecurity in romantic relationships has played out where I started to think that because of some of the things about me that aren't so great, that I just wasn't a worthy partner. And that people would date me, but then realize that I'm not a worthy partner and then want to leave. And that was the mindset that I had about this. That was the limiting belief that I carried. And it was like that imposter. I'm okay as long as you don't really see me.
Yeah. So right to start with, once you find out who I really am, then you'll be out the door.
That's right. That's right. And unfortunately, that's what kept playing out for me. And obviously, partly because I set it up that way. In general, they talked about the imposter syndrome can kind of function low grade, kind of chronically in the background, or there may be some times where the instances are much more intense, like a big project that you're working on for work, or a big event. Maybe you're hosting a large event and, everyone's eyes are on you and whether you measure up. Unfortunately, what they said is this whole piece of when we realize that we did okay in that situation, and then we get this feeling like, oh, that was just this time, but next time it's going to be worse. Unfortunately, for most of us, what that does is it actually increases our anxiety, because now the stakes are even higher for the next time. So I think this is important for people to be aware of. They started talking a little bit more about that discomfort and feeling like you don't belong. And again, going back to the episode you and I did before, Rick Hansen said that one of the things he has learned to do, because he often feels like an outsider, so one of the things he learned to do to help him with that is when he would go to a conference or a workshop, he would start introducing himself one at a time to each person. Maybe at lunch, talk to this person. And then at the second break, talk to this person, so that he was not an outsider. Even though he had not been to as many of these conferences as some of them, or was not as well known, he started to chip away at that feeling of not belonging by becoming more connected and belonging more. And he even talked about the power sometimes of acknowledging, I feel a little bit like an imposter here, because chances are pretty good many of the people there are experiencing that as well. And so acknowledging it can help take some of the power away from it. He also talked about the fact that it's usually more helpful to focus on the inner sense of worthiness rather than trying to strengthen the external forces at play. You know, many people think, well, I'm going to have to prove to these people, I have to do something great to show them that I am worthy and an insider, not an outsider. He said that what he has learned as usually the one trying to impress others the least comes across as the most competent.
Yeah, definitely.
And so the one who's pushing to prove their competence to everyone, it actually usually reveals that they're needing to prove that for some reason.
And also you've got the least control over being able to change that. You can't really change.
Right.
I mean, I suppose you kind of think you can change, because if you prove yourself, then you're thinking, but it's this whole messing with your head thing, isn't it? Where you're imagining what other people are thinking about you and all the rest of it. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Focus on the inner stuff, which is something you can do about.
I was going to say,
even if it's easier said than done.
Yeah, which is the only part that we really can do something about.
You do have control over that, potentially. Like I say, easier said than done, but it is something you can change.
Absolutely. They talked about the fact that it helps us generally if we can work on moving away from the comparison, because really imposter syndrome is often triggered by cues of negative comparison. Either an external ideal, like, oh, Barbara did such a great job on her speech, I can't possibly do as well. Mine isn't even as long as hers, or something like that. Or a theoretical comparison, like thinking, you know, I won't ever be able to live up to the expectations my parents had for me or whatever. So a very specific external ideal or a theoretical piece that we've learned to accept as the expectation.
It's so funny because I just a little while back, I put a note to ask you. I put imposter and comparison. Are they regular bedfellows? Because it's something that straight away popped into my mind as you're talking about these things and sort of relating it to how I feel about things. And yeah, almost always, for me anyway, the two go together. When I'm feeling that imposter syndrome, it usually comes on the back of comparison.
Absolutely.
They do it so well. What's the point of me doing it? Because they do it better. So now I'm just looking at myself thinking, oh, I'm nowhere near as good as, even though, you know, a few days before someone might have been talking about something I've been doing and how well I explain something about planting or garden design or something like that. And then that's an example that actually happened. And then I'll watch about Chelsea Flower Show on the television and think, oh, well, I'll never be as good as them. You know, well, one, it's stupid because I'm comparing myself to, you know, famous, very experienced garden designers who, you know, are really good at the top of their game, all the rest of it. So I'm already comparing myself. It's nowhere near a like for like comparison, but but that is definitely a pattern that I follow with all sorts of things. When I think I've built a skill with something, And then I'll maybe try and improve that skill by going and watching some other people do it or doing some research about it. And then I read about other people, watch other people. Oh, well, there's no point.
Yeah. If you could
Why
just
am I doing this?
If you could just stop before you get to that point and say, yes, I'm watching them because I'm learning. I'm absorbing some of their experience versus I'm going to start to put myself in a less than category. A couple months ago, went and did my first work at pottery, throwing pots. And then I started watching whatever the show is, the Great Pottery Challenge.
Throwdown. Yeah, I love that.
And I experienced some of that too. Like, oh, well, I'll never be like them. What's the point? Versus this is fun to do. Let me see what I can observe. What can I pick up from what they're doing? And in the case you're talking about with the garden thing, let's say it's about someone hiring you to do a plan for them. And then you say, oh, well, I'm obviously not as good as yes, but they're not hiring her. They don't have that access. They want what you know. And I think that's some of that work, that inner work that we need to do. We need to start owning what we do bring to the table rather than focus on what we don't. And this goes back to the whole gap and the gain kind of talk. But think about, what do I actually bring? And Rick Hansen talked quite a bit about that in this episode, authenticity being a really important piece of this. The more you can authentically own who you are, what you do bring, the strengths that you have, the things that you're still learning, the more authentic you can be, the less room there is for the imposter syndrome, the less need there is for this comparison. So I thought that was really important. And he used this analogy that I thought was helpful for me just thinking about it, that, when you think of an imposter, he said it's like going to a party wearing a costume that gets you in, but you're afraid that the costume will be taken away and you will be revealed. So I think in some way to start thinking about, what if the mask does come down? What will be revealed? The more I can own, again, going back to what I just said, own what I do bring to the table. It's okay that the mask comes down. I don't have to masquerade as something else, but just be myself. And obviously, if more of us could work on being comfortable with that, we wouldn't even be having a conversation about imposter syndrome.
I'll tell you an interesting thing that I often think on this topic of authenticity. When you think you know yourself, you think you know your views, you think you know your skill set. And of course, we're always learning and we're always curious to learn new things. But the sort of process that I've often gone through, and it's sort of similar but a little bit different to this comparison thing. You know what I'm like? I'm a rebel and I'm a questioner. So that, going back to the Gretchen Rubin thing, but this questioner thing, I always like researching things. So I like watching videos on YouTube. I like learning new things about something especially something I'm newly interested in, or some sort of slight tweak to something that I've been doing a certain way, and somebody suggests a different way of doing things. I've been watching loads of videos on no-dig gardening and permaculture and things like that, things I've sort of known a little bit about but not that much, and I'm really keen on. So yeah, let's watch all the things. And I get a bit carried away, but I struggle a little bit with that because I think of myself as being generally quite authentic. I'm me, and you kind of take it or leave it, even though the imposter thing comes in. But then I sort of struggle with that. If I get interested in something and it changes my opinion on something, then I start questioning, well, how can you have been authentic with that if now you're making a real change to what you thought you were being authentic about, who you were and all the authenticity that goes around that. Now you're going in a different direction. So is the new bit authentic, or is the old bit authentic? Or am I overthinking things as usual? Do you know what I mean? You start sort of questioning yourself. And so again, it's this sort of imposter kind of, well, wasn't I imposter then? Or am I now? Or I'm lost.
Are both authentic?
Yeah.
That's where I was at that time.
Just a development. Yeah.
This is how I've evolved on this to this point, and chances are good it may end up somewhere else in the future. But I think that's a good point about the imposter syndrome is we feel like we have to be fully developed on all things before we can be seen as credible enough or competent enough or feel confident enough about it. And I think some of the people in the medical world that I admire the most are people who were trained traditionally, eventually saw problems with that, felt there were incomplete ways of treating that were happening and pursued more, and now are in a more functional medicine way. I actually give them 1,000 times more credit because they were authentic at one point believing this. They started to see some of the cracks that you could fall between, and they learned more and they changed where they stand on it. They didn't just say, nope, this is what I decided 25 years ago and this is where I'm going to stay. So I think really being able to acknowledge your authenticity at any given point, and it may look different over time.
Yes, that makes sense. So actually, yeah, authenticity is just being true to who you are. And even if that means that you've done a 180 on something, you are being authentic because you're owning that. Like you say, you were authentic when you were doing or saying or educating on one topic, and just because you think differently about it now, but you can't have the two. It's wrong to compare the two together.
And in actuality, I think it goes back to feeling insecure in some way that I didn't know enough to be right then. How do I know I'm right now versus this is where I am right now? It's authentic. So again, kind of just summing up some of their conversation and some of what you and I are saying, I think it's really important for all of us to continue working more on our inner acceptance of ourselves versus the goal of earning and proving our worthiness through achievements. Because again, there will always be another thing to have to prove or have to achieve. And it will feel great when you first reach it, but then there will be more. Versus inner acceptance doesn't need more proof, doesn't need to be shown again and again. It's just there and is strong. One last comment that Rick made that I thought was really important. He said, he has found that allies can be really helpful. So maybe people who are a little bit ahead of you in that field or in that part of life, so maybe it's a relationship mentor or an ally, someone that cares a lot about you and cares about your development. Oftentimes these people can help reinforce that you do belong, that you're already there. And I know that's been really important for me in my career after I left psychology and I'm working now with TFM. When Dr. Nadia Pataguana says, oh, I loved listening to your video, it's like, really? Oh my gosh, I do belong here. Or when, Megan Ramos says, yes, I'd like you to do this. That vote of confidence helps me step into it more, not to prove more to them, but to accept in myself, I am welcomed here. I do belong.
Yeah, it proves to yourself.
Yeah. I don't have to keep comparing myself and searching for that next step I need to take.
Yeah, I think that's all really interesting, and that of course is the important thing, is to work on what's going on in your head. But I really like that last bit about finding some allies, and ideally finding allies that are ahead of you, not trying to be the one that's at the top, the one that knows all the things that everyone else looks up to in your subject, because you've always got to prove yourself to be the one who knows, but to actively seek out people who do know more than you. And as you were saying, with commenting on me watching these videos, because that's, although they're not personal allies, you can kind of look on them as allies, people that you find on YouTube who have a great channel on a subject. They can become your online allies if you look at it as the ally as somebody I'm learning from. It's not quite the same as you're talking about, these personal relationships you have where you can get that feedback from them and things. But rather than looking at it as a comparison, and you'll never be as good as them. But as you were saying before, looking at them as someone you can get inspiration from. But the more you kind of get to know them by watching more things, watching more of their videos on YouTube and things like that, you can maybe sort of get that mindset that they're my ally, they're someone I'm learning from, they're somebody who's helping me develop.
Mm-hmm. And I think you end up eventually kind of incorporating them into your own acceptance of yourself because you're learning from their shared knowledge. I was thinking about in the fasting method community, I think I hear the imposter syndrome coming out a lot with people feeling like this, I got lucky this time. Let's say someone did some hard work and got some results they wanted. They reversed their diabetes, or they resolved their fatty liver, or they lost 20 pounds. I still often hear that hesitation, like I didn't really do it myself. I just got lucky because this happened, but that won't happen next time. And again, it leaves them feeling like there's more to be proved. Okay, I did okay with this 20 pounds, but I don't know about that next 20 pounds. We just have oftentimes we have such a hard time kind of taking credit for our capabilities, our hard work, who we are and what we bring to the table, that we write it off to other things. And I think it's hard to hold on to those positive gains when we don't own them. They just happen to us somehow. And then they're going to be taken away versus I know how to do this. I've done this. I can do it again. I can do more of it when needed. That inner confidence really changes the imposter syndrome, I think.
And I guess that's another way to look at this concept of having allies. This is where allies are important to give you that different perspective, to sort of smack you around the head and say, when you're saying that, oh, yeah, I got lucky this time. No, hold on a minute. You didn't get lucky. Great job, because you put a lot of work into that. And yeah, with your 20 pounds example and reversing diabetes, whatever it is, the stage you're at, I think it happens a lot when there's still feels like there's so far to go. But yeah, good job with where you've got now. And that should give you the confidence to take the next step. And it's not necessarily going to be the same for the next 20 pounds as it was for that 20 pounds. You might need to learn some new things. You might need to adapt what you've been doing. You might need to make some tweaks along the way. But how easy is that going to be? Because you're building on this dramatic change that you've already made. Reminder, great job on that. So rather, as you always said, you always talk about celebrating the small steps along the way, but also celebrating the big milestones along the way. And wow, this is a real achievement. And this stands me in great stead for the next milestone that's in the distance.
They also quoted from James Clear, one of our favorites, that the Atomic Habits really is about 1% better. It's not about becoming expert today.
Yeah.
It's about continuing to grow, continuing to strengthen our abilities, our knowledge, whatever it is. So it was just a really nice episode, kind of reinforcing a lot of things that we all talk about. And I really encourage anyone, if they feel like they're struggling with imposter syndrome, this might be a nice episode to go back and listen to. I think I'm going to listen to it more than once just to keep kind of fresh in what I want to be doing about my own imposter syndrome and how I let that hold me back at times. And how can I get out of my own way with that?
Yes, definitely. It sounds like something I will be enjoying listening to this week.
Very good.
So until we meet again next week, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.